September 1862. My dear wife, there is nothing of interest here to write about except perhaps our hospital operations. For days our wounded lay in old barns or in the yards on straw. 7/10 of them have suffered amputations, and many die each day. No one can begin to estimate the agony after a battle. We win a great victory, it goes to the country and the masses rejoice, but if all could see the thousands of poor suffering men, the rejoicing would turn to weeping. When I think of the Battle of Antietam, it seems so strange. Who permits it? Countless men hurling against each other in deadly conflict, slaying each other by the thousands, mangling and deforming their fellow men. Oh, what I would not give to see you again. Well, good night, and may God preserve us all. William. A copy of this letter by Dr. William Child, a Union surgeon during the Civil War, is just one of 100,000 wartime correspondences archived at the Center for American War Letters at Chapman University. When I first started this project to seek out and preserve these correspondences, Dr. Child's letter is one of the first that I read. And I remember how it stuck me then and has kind of stayed with me for all this time, because he so perfectly articulated the distance between civilians like myself and people who've experienced war firsthand, like Dr. Child. I've never served in the armed forces, nor has anybody in my immediate family. In fact, I didn't even like history growing up. To me, it was just like this tedious memorization of dates, events, and places. And then, on a Friday, December 15th, during my sophomore year in college, while I was in New York, my dad called from Washington, D.C. to say that our family house had burned to the ground. I thought he was joking at first. He has kind of a mischievous sense of humor. He's done this before. And I was going into final exams. And I said, this really isn't the time. And he said, actually, I'm serious. One of the electrical outlets burst, the sparks went on the carpet, and the house is gone. Not long after the fire, a distant cousin of mine named James Carroll Jordan, who was a veteran, he had served in World War II, called just to check in to see how we were doing. And I said, James, thankfully nobody was hurt. That's the most important thing. But everything we have is destroyed. And the worst part of it was losing all those old letters and photographs. And he said, it's interesting you say that, because I was just going through my old World War II footlocker. And I came across a letter to my wife, Betty Ann, that I wrote back when I was 23 years old. And I'll send it to you. So not long afterwards, I got this in the mail. This is the actual letter. And he starts out, Dear Betty Ann, I saw something today that makes me realize why we're over here fighting this war. James went on in explicit detail about walking through the Nazi concentration camp at Buchenwald, which had just been liberated. People were still dying because of malnourishment and disease, and he talked to his wife about seeing the stacks of bodies and going through in the crematoriums and the torture department and the beating devices, which, in his words, still had blood on them. And Jim had written the letter on this thin onion skin paper. And I'll never forget holding it for that first time and thinking how delicate and fragile it was, and what a stark contrast this was to the weight and significance of his words. While talking to a dear friend of mine, Ann Tramer, about this experience, she said, my grandfather wrote a letter that I just came across that I'll share with you. And sure enough, she sent it in, and it was by her grandfather, Erwin Blonder. And he starts out by saying, Dear Dad and Jerry, I am a forward observer in the battalion. This is one of the most dangerous positions in combat. I've witnessed things I will never forget. I saw an artillery shell chew up one of my men. My only thought now is to get safely home to my wife so that she and I can live our lives that we dreamed as always. I hope that when peace descends upon the world again, we will prove capable of having peace. I don't want my children to endure the things I have. After reading James and Erwin's letters, it was like history came to life. It was real, it was personal, it was human. And this was the inspiration to actively find and preserve war letters from every U.S. conflict. And so after Dear Abby, wrote a Veterans Day column about this project, which appeared in newspapers across the country, it's like the floodgates opened. And I remember the post office where I'd set up a little P.O. box called, and they were not happy. And they said, "Is this Andrew Carroll?" I said, "Yes, it is." They were like, "You need to get down here now and start picking up your mail." And I said, "Look, I live a few blocks from you guys. I will jump on my bike. I've got a huge backpack. I'll be over there in a few seconds." And the clerk sort of chuckled. He said, "You might want to bring a car. We can't even walk around here." And sure enough, when I got there were bins and bins of letters. And this was just the tip of the iceberg. There were thousands more to come in. But one of the first that I opened just gave me a sense of the history that they captured. This is by a young sailor who wrote, "Dear Sis, it's 9:05 a.m. Sunday morning, and we've been bombed for over an hour. And our aircraft guns are yammering away, and every so often a bomb blows up and strikes the edge of this ship." What's incredible is that when you read the upper right-hand corner, you get a sense of its significance right away. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. This young sailor, William Seiko, was inside that ship as the invasion was happening. And he went on moment by moment explaining what it felt like to be in the eye of the storm. And he went on for 50 pages. He was trapped in the forward engine room, and he could hear men screaming over the intercom, and people were rushing for their gas masks. And eventually he was rescued, and this is why we have the letter, of course. What was also interesting is that letters that didn't seem to say much actually had some secrets to reveal. This is a letter by a Marine who also served in World War II. And he starts the letter off, "My beloved, another Sunday, and we're still apart." And he goes on to say, "There are so many things that I'm concerned about, namely you and Aunt Ruth." Well, fairly common expression of worry for family members and so forth. But what is great is that the Marine, Bert Drennan, his son gave us all this, including the code sheet. This is what Bert left behind with his wife. Explicit instructions on when she got a letter that began only when, "My beloved," look for the code name of an aunt or uncle. So on the other side of this page are all these names. None of these people existed. Pure fiction. So in this case, Aunt Ruth meant he was still training in the Hawaiian Islands, but he had some idea where the Marines might end up. And so Aunt Pearl equaled Iwo Jima, and then the very final entry was Uncle Jack, Japan. Some troops use censorship to their example. This is a letter by another World War II soldier named Bill Kaiser, who was in the Philippines serving with MacArthur. This is November of 1944. And he starts off the letter, "Dear Mom and Dad, so here I am in," and then the whole middle part of the letter is gone. And he says, "Well, I hope so too. Love, Bill. P.S. They might censor this letter." Now, I had seen correspondences at this point where, the censors had literally cut out the name of a ship or an island because you couldn't give away your location. But this is like Bill had divulged the entire Pacific campaign. And what I found out from his brother Ernie, who gave us the letter, is that what would happen is Bill would take a piece of paper, he'd write the first line, jump down to the bottom, write the last line. He would cut out the middle, blame the censors, and it was simply because he hated writing letters home, and this was easier. So. What was just so incredible about the correspondences was the paper itself, and how even that gave you a sense of the harrowing circumstances under which these troops were writing. A young soldier named John McGrath was part of the liberation of Italy in 1944, so he was at the Anzio beachhead, and he's describing to a friend of his how a shell had dropped right next to him, but didn't explode. So in his words, by the grace of God, he was still alive. So he writes this letter describing this experience to his friend, and then he puts the letter in his rucksack. Moments after writing that, he was shot through the back. That's the bullet hole from the round that went through the letter and into him. Now, fortunately, he recuperated, he made it home safely, and he was okay. But again, it just gives you an idea of the life and death circumstances under which these troops were writing. Now, 50 years later, a woman named Sandy Mitten, who was she was a Port Security 1 with the Coast Guard, was in the Persian Gulf. And she wrote this letter back to family members, and it was about a week after the war began, and she said, so it's about 5 days in the war, amazing, isn't it? And on the back here, she says, "If I ever had any doubts about weather," and then the letter just cuts off. And then she says, back again, next PM. In the middle of that sentence, they had a Scud missile attack. And she went on to describe what it felt like to be right there with the missiles coming in, not knowing if at any moment your life was going to be over. We very much want to include the home front, because the spouses, the siblings, the children, they all serve too in times of war. This is a letter that we just got days ago, and it's become one of my favorites. It was written during the Korean War, and it's written by a woman to her brother who was off serving in the Korean War, and it's about 10 pages long. And what I love about it is that she wanted to send her brother something special, something that no other service member had gotten. I've never seen a letter like this before, and again, it's 10 feet tall. And what I think is so poignant is at the very end of it, she's like, if this letter isn't long enough, I'll send you another one. But what's also so incredible about these correspondences is that there's definitely a tangible quality to the paper itself, of holding in your hand something that was composed decades or maybe even centuries ago. This is the oldest letter in our collection. It is as pristine and as legible as the day it was written back in 1775. This is from the American Revolution. Now, having said that, some of the most eloquent and powerful correspondences we have are emails from Iraq, Afghanistan, and other parts of the world. Ed Rivnak was an Air Force captain in 2003, and he was serving on medevac flights that were taking our wounded from Baghdad to our military base in Landstuhl, Germany. And like William Child from the Civil War, Ed felt there was a kind of disconnect between the public perception of the war and its realities. So he started writing these letters home to his family and to his friends, and in one he wrote, and this is about a relatively small load of troops. The patients include 1 gunshot wound to the stomach, partial amputations from a landmine, massive head wound from being struck by a tank, and blast and shrapnel injuries. There was also a fellow medical officer that Ed treated who had been taking supplies to a civilian hospital in Baghdad when his Humvee was attacked by an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, and the flames engulfed him from the waist up. He was burned over most of his body, Ed wrote, and the tops of his ears were burned off entirely. His red, peeling face had become an expressionless mask. Ed made a point of focusing not just on the physical injuries and the condition of his patients, but on their mental wounds as well. In another email he wrote, "A soldier confides in me that he witnessed some Iraqi children get run over by one of our military convoys. The soldier was in the convoy, and they had strict orders not to stop. Its insurgents have forced Iraqi boys and girls at gunpoint into the road to break up the convoys so the insurgents can attack us. But now the convoys don't stop." He tells me that dealing with that image is worse than the pain of his injury. War's brutality is the secret that even civilized societies keep from itself, hiding under layers of verbal camouflage of phrases like soft targets, collateral damage, and friendly fire. And certainly no correspondence, whether an email or a letter, can fully convey the true horror of war. But I think they do give us a very personal and intimate glimpse into not just what these troops have seen, but what it feels like to be at war. And they remind us that their sacrifices extend beyond the battlefield. It's not just it's not just the risk of being wounded or killed, which is bad enough. It's the strain on their relationships. It's the time away from their loved ones. It's not being there for a birthday, an anniversary, or even when a child is born. And for those who do come home, for the memories that they will live with forever. In late September 1944, a young American soldier who had nearly been killed in battle and was literally writing a letter while he was huddled in a foxhole as shells were falling around him, wrote home, "I'm telling you all this to get certain things off my mind, but also because I want these thoughts of mine recorded so in later years I can use them in getting a better understanding of life instilled in my children." That soldier was Erwin Blonder, my friend Ann's grandfather, who had written to his brother and to his dad. Blonder, like many troops, found writing letters cathartic. But I think he also knew that his letter wasn't just for himself or its recipients, but that maybe one day future generations would hear it and possibly even learn from it. Which is why ultimately these letters to me represent America's great undiscovered literature. Millions of them tucked away in attics and basements and closets across the country. And like any great work of art, they transcend any subject matter. They're really not just about war, but about human nature itself, about our capacity for a breathtaking sense of violence and destruction. but also our potential for goodness, our courage, our resilience, our compassion, our generosity, our sense of forgiveness and reconciliation. Our mission remains to inspire people across the country to seek out and find as many letters as possible. These letters are being used in military hospitals and VA medical centers to help troops who are coping with post-traumatic stress understand that they're not alone. And they're reaching a larger civilian audience in books and documentaries, and there's a play directed by John Bennett. It's incredible. It's been performed at the Kennedy Center and the Kirk Douglas Theater and other prestigious venues. These transcripts have been etched on war memorials across the country. And what I think is most important is that high school and college students are having these letters part of their curricula, and it's bringing history to life. It's making it real for them as well. And I think they remind all of us that these troops are not just statistics, and they're certainly more than Marines, sailors, airmen, and soldiers. Every single one of them is somebody's child. And in many cases, they're a parent themselves, a sibling, a wife, a husband, a sweetheart. These are their voices, their experiences, as they have expressed them in their own words. And nobody, I think, can tell their story better than they can. Thank you all.